The year is 1945. The Thousand-Year Reich, a nightmare regime that once stretched from the shores of France to the gates of Moscow, is breathing its last. Its vast empire has collapsed, its cities are smoldering ruins, and its armies are shattered remnants. Now, in the heart of the Reich, the capital city of Berlin awaits its final judgment. On the horizon, the largest and most powerful army ever assembled in European history, the Soviet Red Army, prepares to deliver the final, crushing blow. This is the story of the Battle of Berlin, the apocalyptic crescendo of World War II in Europe. Over 2 bloody, desperate weeks in April and May 1945, the capital of Nazi Germany would be transformed into a hellscape of fire, steel, and vengeance. This was not merely a battle, it was an execution, a Götterdämmerung that would not only destroy a city and a regime but would also draw the final, Iron Curtain across a continent, setting the stage for the new global conflict that would define the next half-century. The state of the Reich. By early April 1945, Germany's strategic situation was not just hopeless, it was non-existent. In the West, American, British, and French forces, having shattered the last German resistance in the Ardennes, had crossed the Rhine. They were now fanning out across the German interior, capturing entire army groups and liberating cities with stunning speed. In the east, the Red Army stood poised for the kill. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Kohn's First Ukrainian Front, fresh from the monumental Vistula-Oder offensive, had pushed German forces back hundreds of kilometers. They now stood massed on the banks of the Oder and Neisse rivers, a mere 60 kilometers, a day's tank drive, from the outskirts of Berlin. In the center of this collapsing world, Adolf Hitler remained secluded in his subterranean concrete tomb, the Führerbunker, beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Here, 50 feet underground, he had descended into a world of pure delusion. Surrounded by a sycophantic inner circle, he spent his days shuffling phantom armies on maps, issuing commands to divisions that existed only on paper, and raging at the betrayals he imagined on all sides. He demanded a fight to the last man, woman, and child. His Nero decree of March 19 had ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure, bridges, railways, factories, and utilities, to prevent their use by the advancing enemy. It was a final, nihilistic act, a scorched earth policy aimed not at the enemy, but at the German people themselves, whom he deemed unworthy of surviving his failure. Berlin, he vowed, would either be the site of his final triumph or his tomb. The opposing forces. The Soviet force marshaled for this final offensive was biblical in scale. Joseph Stalin, fostering a fierce and deeply personal rivalry between his top commanders, unleashed 2 massive army groups, designated as fronts. To the north, facing Berlin directly, was Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. To the south, along the Neisse River, was Marshal Ivan Kohn's First Ukrainian Front. A third, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, would advance on the far north to pin down German remnants and protect Zhukov's flank. Together, Zhukov and Konev commanded over 2.5 million soldiers, an ocean of manpower. This force was supported by an incredible 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 7,500 combat aircraft that would own the skies, and over 41,000 artillery pieces and mortars. This concentration of firepower was unprecedented, granting Soviet commanders the ability to erase any defensive position from the map. Stalin dangled the ultimate prize, the honor of taking the Reichstag and capturing Berlin, before both Zhukov and Konev, inciting a frantic race that would prioritize speed and glory over caution, at a tremendous cost in human lives. Defending the capital was a spectral force, a ghost of the once mighty Wehrmacht. General Gotthard Heinrichi, a master of defensive warfare, had been given the impossible task of commanding Army Group Vistula. His forces consisted of the battered remnants of the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Army. These were units in name only, composed of exhausted veterans, convalescents, and new recruits. The city's defense, organized into 3 concentric rings, was supplemented by the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. This was a people's militia of old men, veterans of the First World War, and boys as young as 13, all poorly equipped, given perhaps a single Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, and expected to die for their Führer. Alongside them were police units, Hitler Youth detachments, and a fanatical corps of foreign SS volunteers, including the French Charlemagne Division and Scandinavian units, who knew that for them, surrender was not an option. The Seelow Heights, gateway to Berlin. Before the assault on Berlin itself could begin, the Red Army had to breach the city's final major defensive bastion, the Seelow Heights. This heavily fortified escarpment, rising 50 meters above the floodplains of the Oder River, was the linchpin of Germany's Oder front defense. General Heinrich, a brilliant tactician, correctly anticipated that Zhukov's main thrust would come directly along the main highway to Berlin. In a clever move, he quietly pulled the bulk of his defenders back to a secondary line, leaving only a thin screening force in the front-line trenches. On the dawn of April 16, Zhukov unleashed his opening gambit. It was one of the most terrifying artillery barrages in the history of warfare. From over 9,000 guns and heavy mortars, a storm of steel rained down on the German positions, churning the earth and sky into a vortex of fire and smoke for hours. Zhukov then ordered a bizarre and theatrical tactic. 143 anti-aircraft searchlights were switched on, their beams directed at the German lines, hoping to blind and disorient the defenders. The plan backfired spectacularly. The beams reflected off the thick morning mist and smoke, perfectly silhouetting the advancing Soviet infantry and tanks for the German machine gunners and anti-tank crews. The first wave of Soviet troops was slaughtered. For 3 agonizing days, Zhukov, enraged by the delay and goaded by reports of Kohn's rapid, successful progress to the south, fed wave after wave of men and tanks into the meat grinder. He abandoned subtlety and ordered costly frontal assaults. The terrain, turned into a swampy quagmire by the spring thaw and the bombardment, bogged down the Soviet T-34s, making them easy targets for hidden German 88mm guns. The heights were finally taken, but at a staggering cost. Over 30,000 Soviet soldiers were killed in just 72 hours, with thousands of tanks destroyed or disabled. It was a grim prelude to the slaughter that awaited inside the city. The encirclement and the Halbe cauldron. With the Seelow Heights shattered, the road to Berlin was open. While Zhukov's blooded First Belarusian front battered its way from the east, Kohn's First Ukrainian front, having crossed the Neisse River with relative ease, was surging from the south. The race to Berlin was on. Kohn's tank armies, led by the 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies, swung north and west, driving deep into the German rear. By April 25, their advanced units linked up with elements of Zhukov's front near Ketzen, west of Berlin. The capital was now completely encircled. That very same day, a historic moment occurred far to the west. Soldiers of Kohn's 5th Guards Army met American troops of the 69th Infantry Division at Torgau on the Elbe River. This symbolic handshake sliced Germany in two and signaled that any organized, large-scale resistance was finished. The encirclement of Berlin also created another, secondary pocket to the southeast. The bulk of the German 9th Army, along with remnants of the 4th Panzer Army, some 200,000 men, were trapped in a forested area near the town of Halbe. This began one of the most desperate and horrific battles of the war's final days. For nearly a week, the trapped Germans, ordered by Hitler to turn and attack north, instead tried to break out west to surrender to the Americans. They threw themselves against the Soviet cordon in a series of suicidal, poorly coordinated attacks. The Red Army, in turn, pounded the Halbe cauldron with relentless artillery and air strikes, turning the pine forests into a charnel house. It was a battle of annihilation. Perhaps 25,000 German soldiers managed to break through the lines and reach the Elbe, but over 60,000 were killed and the rest captured. It was a pointless, brutal epilogue to the defense of the Oder. Urban warfare, hell in the city. With the city surrounded, the battle for Berlin now became a siege and an urban assault. Soviet artillery, positioned on the outskirts, began a relentless, round-the-clock bombardment. Over 2 million shells, an estimated 40,000 tons of high explosives, would be fired into the city, dubbed Stalin's organs for the terrifying shriek of the Katyusha rockets. General Helmuth Weidling, an experienced corps commander who had been appointed commander of the Berlin defense area just days before, after nearly being executed for a misunderstanding, had less than 100,000 exhausted defenders to face millions of fresh Soviet troops. The city's defenses were organized into 3 zones: the outer defense ring, the inner defense ring, along the S-Bahn railway, and the central citadel in the government district. But these were just lines on a map. In reality, the defenses consisted of hasty barricades of rubble, overturned trams, and concrete, manned by the dregs of the Reich. The battle devolved into a savage, intimate, and 3-dimensional struggle. It was fought in the labyrinthine ruins of apartment blocks, in flooded subway tunnels, across shell-blasted parks, and in government buildings. Soviet tactics, honed by years of urban warfare from Stalingrad to Budapest, were brutally effective. They operated in storm groups, combined arms units of infantry, assault engineers with explosives, heavy machine guns, and often a single, supporting heavy tank or self-propelled gun. They avoided the main streets, which had been turned into killing zones by Volkssturm boys armed with panzerfausts. Instead, they used explosives to mouse-hole their way through the cellars and attics of adjoining buildings, clearing rooms one by one with grenades and submachine guns. The Germans fought back with the courage of despair. The few remaining Panther tanks and Tiger tanks, though low on fuel and ammunition, extracted a heavy toll. The massive, concrete Flakturm, or flak towers, colossal anti-aircraft fortresses like the one at the Berlin Zoo, proved impregnable to artillery. Their heavy guns swept the surrounding streets, and their concrete walls provided shelter for thousands of civilians and a fortress for defenders, holding out for days. The fighting was particularly vicious for control of key strategic points: the Moltke Bridge, the Unalte Bahnhof, the shattered Potsdamer Platz, and the Kroll Opera House. The fighting even raged underground in the U-Bahn tunnels, which Weidling's engineers flooded in a desperate attempt to stop Soviet troops from using them as infiltration routes, drowning thousands of soldiers and civilians who had taken shelter there. The Reichstag, the final symbol. The symbolic heart of the Nazi regime, and thus the ultimate objective for the Soviet soldiers, was the Reichstag. Though it was a burnt-out shell, unused by the Nazis since 1933, its capture represented the final, tangible victory over fascism. Stalin himself had demanded that the red banner be flying over the building in time for the May 1st May Day celebrations. The battle for the heavily defended building began on April 29. The Reichstag had been turned into a fortress, its windows bricked up, its surrounding plazas flooded, and its defense entrusted to a fanatical garrison of SS soldiers, sailors, and Hitler Youth. Soviet troops of the 150th Rifle Division had to cross the open, fire-swept expanse of the Königsplatz to reach it. The fighting was merciless. Soviet heavy artillery, including 152mm howitzers, was brought up to point-blank range to blast holes in the thick stone walls. For 2 days, the battle raged, moving from room to room, up the grand staircases, and into the cavernous, debris-filled main chamber. Every corridor was a new battle. Finally, on the evening of April 30th, 2 sergeants, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, were handpicked to raise the Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, atop the building's dome. The iconic photograph of this moment, which would become one of the most famous images of the 20th century, would actually be staged for propaganda purposes 2 days later, but the symbolic act itself signaled the death of the Third Reich. Hitler's end and capitulation. While the Reichstag was falling, the regime's architect met his end. Deep within the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler spent his final, surreal hours. He received news of Mussolini's execution. He learned of Himmler's attempts to negotiate a separate peace. He dictated his final political and personal testaments, blaming the Jews for the war and expelling Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party. Then, on the afternoon of April 30th, with Soviet soldiers just a few hundred meters away, he and his companion of 14 years, Eva Braun, whom he had married less than 40 hours earlier, committed suicide. She bit a cyanide capsule. He shot himself in the head. Following his precise instructions, their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden, doused in petrol by his adjutants, and set ablaze in a shallow shell crater. Joseph Goebbels, his fanatical propaganda minister, assumed the role of chancellor for a single day before he and his wife, Magda, poisoned their 6 young children in the bunker and then had an SS orderly shoot them. The leadership of the Nazi state had evaporated. A desperate breakout attempt by the bunker's remaining occupants, led by SS General Mohnke, failed. The only authority left was General Weidling, who, on the morning of May 2nd, crossed the Soviet lines and formally surrendered the Berlin garrison, ordering all remaining German troops to lay down their arms. The aftermath and legacy. The human cost of this final battle was staggering. The Red Army suffered over 350,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in the broader Berlin operation, including the Seelow Heights and Halbe. It was a terrible price for a victory that was already strategically assured. German military losses are estimated at around 100,000 killed in the city, with nearly 500,000 taken prisoner. The toll on the civilian population was even more horrific. An estimated 125,000 civilians perished during the fighting from bombardment, starvation, crossfire, and in the wave of mass suicides that swept the city as fear of Soviet retribution took hold. Berlin itself was a wasteland, a stunned null or 0 hour. It was a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal. Over 80% of the city center was destroyed. There was no power, no clean water, and little food. The Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, would spend years clearing the debris, becoming a symbol of the city's eventual rebirth. The Battle of Berlin was the definitive, thunderous end of World War II in Europe. It was a military operation of unparalleled scale and ferocity, marking the total and unconditional defeat of Nazi Germany. On May 8, 1945, what became known as VE Day, representatives of the German High Command signed the final instrument of surrender in Berlin-Karlshorst. The guns finally fell silent over a continent in ruins. But the battle's conclusion did not bring universal peace. It cemented the division of Germany and Europe that had been decided at Yalta. It left Soviet forces in total control of the eastern half of the continent. Berlin, the city whose capture had been the final prize, would itself be divided, becoming the central flashpoint and frontline of a new, decades-long ideological conflict, the Cold War. The ruins of the Reichstag stood not only as a monument to the defeat of fascism but also as a somber harbinger of the fractured world that would emerge from its ashes.